Hello, good evening. My name's Kate Proctor. I'm the political correspondent for The Guardian newspaper. I'm here in a very sunny Westminster this evening for a hustings with the two Liberal Democrat candidates, and tonight it's all about the Green agenda. So I'd like to welcome first Ed Davey.
Hello.
And I'd like to welcome Layla Moran.
Hello.
So we'll just get on with a few housekeeping things first of all. So tonight's event runs for around 80 minutes. We'll be taking questions from audience members and everyone that's watching from home. If you can do that by watching on YouTube, please do send your questions in and we'll pick them up and we'll be able to put them to the candidates as well. There's also a British Sign Language version which is accessible through the Zoom link on the live stream page as well, and also I think on the Liberal Democrat website too. So tonight is all about the Green agenda, and we are going to hear from both candidates. They're going to have open remarks, and we're going to start with Layla first, as Ed started last time.
Thank you. The climate and nature emergencies pose a huge threat to our country and the whole of humankind. As we contend with the coronavirus crisis, we must not forget about the ongoing environmental and nature crises. My ambition as leader is to rebuild trust with voters and win again, so that we can make our liberal voice heard and recapture our position as the most environmentally credible party. The environment must be at the heart of everything that we do. We don't just need house building, we need sustainable house building. We need transport policies that give everyone the option of zero carbon travel. And we must incentivise people to drive electric cars, invest in rail and not road, and get people walking and cycling. We need economic policies that encourage businesses to improve their green credentials. We need all this, along with a full and proper plan to rewild Britain. But above all, we need to be ambitious. I want our party to go beyond our current target of cutting emissions to net zero. Instead, I want us to make our country carbon negative by 2045. And let's be world leading too, by raising our aid budget to 1%, with an extra 0.3% ring-fenced to tackle the environmental crisis abroad. We have progressive policies that work for people and the planet. But to change our country, to drive our incredible liberal values, our party needs to change. We're languishing at 6% in the polls and have been for months. Changing our party means moving forward from the mistakes of the last decade with a leader who can credibly advocate for progressive green ideas and win back trust and support. Because quite simply, we can't afford anything less. Even with economies grinding to a halt during this pandemic, greenhouse gases are still only projected to fall by 4 to 7%. And look at what we're up against. A Tory government of delayers, who are frankly no better than the climate change deniers. I fought them in my constituency and in Westminster to protect our environment. And earlier this year, I worked with MPs across parties to bring Greta Thunberg to Parliament, where she challenged their disastrous record. In listening sessions with over 300 local parties across the United Kingdom, Liberal Democrats have told me that this is one of their top priorities, and it's mine too. And my campaign themes of education, the environment and the economy reflect that priority. Because education and the economy are both inextricably linked to making a positive, radical change and promoting a progressive environmental agenda. I'm asking you in this leadership election to vote for me so that we can move our party forward together, fight for the most ambitious environmental policies ever, and deliver the change that our country and our planet so desperately, desperately needs.
Okay, so that's the Green agenda, as you've heard from Layla Moran. So now let's hear from Ed Davey.
Our future. That's what climate emergency threatens. Famines, floods, fires. That's what we face. When I was leading climate talks at the United Nations, pushing for a strong global action, we would face stony faces from ministers of fossil fuel countries. I'll never forget the impassioned speech of my friend, the late Tony de Brum, then a minister from the Marshall Islands in the Pacific. Tony told the stony faces, "My people go to bed wearing life jackets. They're so worried about the rising sea. We face extinction." My friends, our party must be the party that stands up for our planet. My green vision is this: domestic action on climate, international action on climate on a scale never seen before. I propose a green economy recovery plan, a massive £150 billion investment to propel Britain's green economy. Green homes, insulated, warm and cheap to heat. Green transport, quiet, clean and healthy. Green power, solar, wind and tidal, re-greening nature, peat bogs, marshlands, forests. And all this creating green jobs in every region and nation. I can deliver this vision because I've delivered ambitious green projects before. Fighting the Tories, I won for our climate. I nearly quadrupled Britain's renewable power. We made Britain the world leader in offshore wind. You should be proud to be a member of the party with the best record on climate change. But you should want your leader to have the vision, experience and credibility to deliver much more. And not just in Britain. We emit just 2% of global greenhouse gases. We must go global, from action to save rainforests to spreading solar and wind power the world over. It isn't just about stopping climate change or rebuilding nature's biodiversity. My green vision aims for a fairer, more peaceful world too. I want the world's poorest 1 billion to have the electricity the fossil fuel firms never gave them, with microgrids of solar and wind power to keep food and medicines cool, to enhance their studies and their work. I want to impoverish dictators in the Kremlin and Saudi Arabia with a world that doesn't need their oil, so they don't have the cash to oppress their own people or fund wars abroad. If you want a leader with the experience and vision to deliver that greener world, then please back me this week. Thank you.
Thanks very much. I just wanted to pick you up on just a couple of things there quickly from your opening remarks. Ed, you were talking about a significant amount of investment there. As we head towards an economic downturn, how are you supposed to bring people with you that, you know, that level of investment is the right thing to do on the economy? And then really the same question for you, Leda. I'm not sure if you mentioned a figure, but I'd be interested to know how would you raise so much money, and how would you convince people that green issues are a priority when it's going to be such a tough economic climate?
Well, first of all, we need the jobs. We are looking at record levels of unemployment. And so we've got to act. And I think a Keynesian boost, both to get those green jobs and also fast track the transition to a climate economy, looks like the right thing. It's bringing two problems together and solving them together. Yes, we'd have to pay for it mainly through borrowing. But borrowing is at record levels of cheapness. Borrowing's never been so cheap. And borrowing to save the future is what the future wants us to do. If we don't borrow now to invest to save the future, there won't be a future. This has to happen. And it has to be big, and it has to be urgent, and it has to be now. And I want our party to lead that.
And Leda, what about you? What about your thoughts on investment? How would you go about it?
Well, by and large, I actually agree with that assessment. This is now the time to invest. And actually, if you look back across the history and the ages of our country, when there are big crises like these, whether it was the Spanish flu or the World War II, then it is right that the government borrows money to invest in the economy. But there is a phrase that's well used: build back better. It comes from the United Nations, actually, and I brought together a book of parties' ideas around how are we going to use this opportunity to spread liberal ideas. But in the economics chapter, it makes very clear this is the right time to invest in green recoveries. And actually, by investing in a green recovery, Smith School in Oxford and others have assessed that supercharges the economy even better than a classic fossil fuel driven recovery. It's not just the right thing to do, it's the smart thing to do.
Did you have a figure like Ed? No?
I have not set an exact figure on it, no, because actually we need to remain nimble, but there's a huge part of this that needs to assess every single bit of our society, whether it's the individual to business to the state. And I'm sure we'll go into some of this detail in a moment.
So actually, Layla, if I could stick with you. So, I mean, the Labour Party have put out their green vision. They made much of it in the last election. But I wondered if you could try and spell out what makes a very specific Liberal vision for a green future. If you could go, and then Ed will come to you.
Well, first of all, a green vision for the country and indeed the world is about using every single sinew of society, the individual and the state in tackling this enormous crisis. I mean, COVID-19, and as difficult it has been, we were joking before how nice it is to see people in 3D in a situation like this. It's been horrible for a lot of people, and it's horrible all the time. But one of the big advantages of it is that it's shown people that there is a different way of doing things, and it's allowing us to almost reset. You know, for the first time, people are seeing the value in green spaces. They're seeing that there's another way of working, which means that they can work from home and not have to jump in the car and get to work. Meanwhile, businesses are growing back, and it's been a really tough time for business, and there is a space for the state, I think, to bail businesses out, but that bailout should not come without green strings. And all together, driven by partly the state here in Westminster, but also by local government, and actually credit to the Liberal Democrat councils across the country that are already setting more ambitious targets than even the government here, setting up climate assemblies where they are gathering support from their local communities to do this bigger and better. It's going to take everyone to play their part. And that's what's Liberal about it, not centralised from Westminster, but asking every single person, including an individual, to get involved.
Okay. And Ed, what's the Liberal vision? What's the Liberal green vision?
To deliver this, you need the state to work with business in partnership. The Tories just want to leave it to the market. The Labour Party, the last election, just wanted to nationalise everything and do it all by the state. We don't. We see the benefits of that partnership. And when I was delivering renewable power, particularly when we managed to become the world leader in offshore wind, it was that state business partnership which I used. So we put forward big subsidies, but we brought in the private sector to compete for those subsidies through auctions that I introduced in law. And by them having to compete for those subsidies, the subsidies went down to nothing. And from a very high price, because I intervened as the minister, as a cabinet minister, we managed to get the price down to a level no one had expected. And we became the world leader in offshore wind. And so I think that state business partnership is what distinguishes a Liberal approach. You've got to have a clear vision, and you've got to know the economic tools to use. And I'd like to apply them not just to renewable power, but I'd like to apply them to green flight. We've got to decarbonise flight. With our aerospace industry in a mess, let's not just bail it out for a fossil fuel future. Let's put the money in for R&D, state support to our aerospace companies so that they fast track a move to zero carbon flight, whether it's through electric planes or hydrogen-driven planes, I don't know. But let the state push that so the private companies can do what they do best, innovate, push prices down and deliver the innovations of the future.
Sorry, but Ed, because you are talking about quite a lot of borrowing, how do you actually distinguish yourself from Labour in terms of how you go about it, the delivery of it?
Well, Labour, I don't know what they want now because we're not clear, but in the last election they wanted to nationalise everything, spend huge amounts of money just on buying back shares and not creating any value. And what I did, I used it's bill payers' money actually, and we forced the private investors and the private companies to compete for that. And so the cost to the bill payer kept going down and down and down as they had to innovate. And so what I did was I used the skills of competition and the markets and private investors, but I made them operate to our tune, the government's tune, the people's tune, the planet's tune. And that's what delivered Britain to be the world leader in offshore wind. And I'd like to use the model that I used successfully in government to deliver it in other green technologies.
And Layla, was there anything you wanted to come back on for just very quickly before we move on to a question
I think it's also about harnessing what I was saying about the value of local government. And one of our key strengths as Lib Dems is that bottom-up approach. So giving local government the tools and the powers that they need to do this, I think, is a key part of a big difference between us and Labour.
Okay. So we're going to go to a question from Emma Farthing. who has written in. So I'll go for it here. So given the relatively weak position of the party in Parliament, how will you mobilise the Lib Dems to effectively influence government on committing to its net zero emissions target by 2050? And we'll go with you first, Ed.
Well, I think because we have experience in our ranks, both in the Commons, in the Lords and in local government, we can punch above our weight on the climate. And that's what I would want to do as leader. I'd want to hold the government to account, but also provide very exciting new ideas. So let's take the big picture. The big picture is we will be hosting COP26. That's the UN climate talks. They were going to happen in Glasgow this November. They've been postponed to next year. This is a moment when Britain holds the pen, not just for our own policies, but crucially the world over. So what is it that we can do that's different? What can we add? Now, I've always argued that we need to make sure that capitalism, the city, banks, pension funds, all that money works for the environment, not just for private profit. And so I've argued for green finance. I've argued, sometimes I use a term, decarbonising capitalism. And what I mean is bringing regulations into the city, into the banks, the pension funds, the debt markets, the stock exchanges, to require them to take account of climate change risks. I chair an all-party parliamentary group on sustainable finance, so working cross-party to deliver these ideas. And the reason why I focus on finance is when you look around the world at all the many things that need to be financed, we need to make sure that every investor has to take account of climate change. And if we did that, it'd be a massive, fast catalyst for moving the world economy through to a green economy, which is what we need.
And Layla, what about you? How are you don't have so many MPs, so how are you going to put the pressure on in Parliament?
Yeah, we have to do this cross-party. And actually, that's one of the things that I bring to my leadership. Working cross-party, I helped to launch the People's Vote back in the day. Through that, I've developed networks in the House. I'm now leading the inquiry, the parliamentary rapid inquiry into coronavirus. We have to use every single network that we've got in Westminster to pile on the pressure. But actually, I think there's also been a little sense, and we do this so much as Lib Dems, we have fantastic, well thought through policies, carbon neutral by 2045, it's honest, it's really well thought through, and yet we failed to break through with that policy at the last general election because it's a bit Goldilocks, because it was somewhere between what the Tories were saying and somewhere between what the Greens were saying and Labour were saying. So that's why I think reframing that policy as carbon negative Britain by 2045 is so important. But as part of that, we have to make sure that we are working with other parties. So when there was the Friday for Future strikes that happened across the UK just a few years ago, I supported them. I was surrounded by 2,000 young people in Bond Square in Oxford, carrying placards, some of them as young as 5. It was beautiful. And they were shouting at us, saying, come on, you're not taking this seriously enough. And off the back of that, I called the first debate on the floor of the House in 2.5 years on climate change. And that pushed the government, with so much support from the public, to commit to 2050. So actually, you as activists and people out there have a huge influence on what happens in Parliament. And our job is partly to inspire them to act more.
But can you think of something you've done within Parliament specifically on zero carbon and hammering home that message to the government?
It's all sorts of different things. So I've written to just Gavin Williamson to talk about how do we make sure that schools are carbon neutral, for example. In my own constituency, whenever we have argued for house building, we talk about making sure that they are zero carbon. And we're looking at, now that we run the Vale of Whitehorse District Council, how can we as a council be carbon neutral by 2030? So that it's never going to be just one thing. It's got to be actually weaved into absolutely every single thing that we do. And one of my proposals in this leadership election is that I actually think we should replace the Treasury, because the Treasury far too often is just driven on the basic idea of growth, but not sustainable growth. We need sustainability to lie at the heart of every single budget in every single department. Other countries, by the way, have already done this, and I think that would be a huge move. And yes, it's a long-term move and one we're not going to deliver with the number of MPs we've got now. But I think what it shows is our ambition for how much we want to change the approach to green agendas here in this country.
And Ed, were you a fan of the school strikes? Was that something that did you go along or have a look at any action that's going on?
Yeah, we did. I think it was so important that we supported them, and I think Liberal Democrat MPs, all of us, got out there into our constituencies when people came to Westminster. It's absolutely critical, because one thing that's most exciting that's happened in the last 2 years is the Greta Thunberg movement, if you like, and the climate strikes, and even Extinction Rebellion, because I think it's really put climate on the map in policies. I know everyone's focused on COVID, understandably, but if you look at the opinion polls, climate change and the environment has never been so high up. When I was working with Paddy Ashton, we were developing green policies in the 1990s. Many people thought we were a bit odd because it was not really on people's agenda. We fought for it. We tried to get it on the agenda. We became the most environmentalist party. It's one of the reasons I joined back in 1989. But then we were almost a lone voice. Now, the challenge for the party is to be the voice that's heard the most, because other people now have got that agenda. I welcome that, by the way, because I want to make progress on the agenda. But for us, we need to get that mantle again to show that we can lead the way, that we have the best ideas, we are the most credible. And I believe, given we've got the best record of any party on climate change, I think we can get that voice out there and can lead public opinion.
So would you support kids missing school on a Friday if those demonstrations continue?
Well, I've said that actually, yes, I do, because the job of us as politicians is to make it so that they don't have to. And I think it says a lot, and I don't know about you, Ed, but I get some gorgeous letters, hand-drawn letters that are in my post bag of, kids as young as 5, 6 asking us, do more on plastic waste in the sea, do more on saving our planet. And they shouldn't have to. We should have dealt with this before. I remember being 8 years old and writing to my local representative about CFCs. And that was a very good campaign that worked, and it was done internationally, and it was actually one of the great success stories. But we need much more of that. And what I find a shame is that, 30 whatever years later, we still haven't got to grips with this. This isn't good enough. So yes, I support it, but we shouldn't have to have them do it. The other thing that I do think we need to do is to weave more education about the environment throughout the curriculum. And if you look at the studies about what is going to supercharge a green recovery right now, all of them mention education. Yeah. Because helping individuals to make better choices is one of the arms that we need to use, one of the levers that we need to pull to make sure that this is sustainable for the future. So that's something I've been pushing quite specifically in Parliament.
And Ed, just very, very quickly, you'd be happy for kids to bunk off school on a Friday to go to these demonstrations if they continue?
Isn't it amazing that they're so determined? And people were just debating this, and Tory ministers were having a go at the youngsters. But I think it was a really interesting lesson, that this was a lesson in life, a lesson in politics, a lesson in the world, a lesson in the environment, a lesson in geography. This was a reality. And I think, seen that way, then I think absolutely we should embrace the fact that young people are actually speaking out. And the key thing is not telling them to get back to school. The key thing is, what are we going to do about it? Mm-hmm. What are we going to do about it? Okay. And that's the reaction. And I think some Tory ministers didn't like the pressure because it showed them up.
Okay, so we're going to move on to another question, which is coming from William Tench. So, Ed, I'm going to start with you on this one. You've spoken a lot about your experience in government, but I want to be very specific. Since 2017, what have you achieved in terms of the green agenda? What can you point to as a concrete example? And it'll be the same for you. Question for you.
Well, I think two things, both inside Parliament and outside Parliament. Inside Parliament, I've obviously argued for the green economy, whether I was on business, whether I was now on the Treasury, and I've helped develop our policies, particularly on this idea of making new laws in the city, and I've led that argument. I've been to see the former Governor of the Bank of England, Mark Carney, and made common cause with him and pushed that. Outside Parliament, in my 2 years outside Parliament between 2015 and 2017, I got involved in the renewable sector. I was chair of a community energy company helping communities get into solar, advising a solar company. And I think that shows my commitment isn't just about political change, it's about trying to help the world go green as fast as possible. And
So is that since 2017?
Well, a bit of it has been since 2017, yeah.
Okay.
And so I think that how you live your life, how you make priorities and what you do inside and outside Parliament speaks volumes. And I'm pretty proud of what I've done inside and outside Parliament to try and promote the green agenda.
Thank you. Layla?
So since I was elected in 2017, so this is about my record as an MP. So one of the things that I've been trying to do is work cross-party on this. I mean, we aren't going to affect real change unless we are working with others. And I've been particularly close in the House in terms of the conversations I've been having and what we want to achieve together with Caroline Lucas, partly because in my own seat in Oxford West and Abingdon, the Greens stood aside for me in the 2017 general election. But before they decided to do that, I got the grilling of my life in a hustings like this, but with a group of Green activists. And at the end of it, I was never so shaken. I left that room absolutely convinced that they absolutely hated me, and yet they unanimously agreed that it was the right thing to do. And I did it by convincing them that we actually had so much more in common. And so since then, when I invited Greta Thunberg to Parliament, it was with her and Ed Miliband. She met the Speaker, but actually critically, she held Gove to account. And one of the things that she raised, which I think is now becoming something that people are recognising, is dodgy accounting by the government in terms of its carbon budget. So in particular, the fact that aviation and shipping is not taken into account. And that was a big stir when she came over. So you're never going to achieve any one thing on your own, but by working with others, you can then raise these big issues. And now that we're looking at, how do you greenify the aviation sector? How can we do this better? That starts to change the narrative. And to change the narrative is the way that we as Lib Dems are going to deliver for people from the position that we are now, not in some fictitious government in the future in 20 years' time.
Ed, were you a bit jealous that Layla was able to bring Greta over, a bit of a political coup?
Well, she worked cross-party to do
Indeed,
it, and
indeed. It wasn't
as
just
you
me.
said, it was quite a few people. No, it was good. I wasn't jealous. I'm delighted. I think we work together.
Yeah.
The Liberal Democrats work together, and we're stronger when we're that family of Liberal Democrats pushing that agenda. And Alea rightly earlier talked about local government. And they are very much part of the Liberal Democrat mission on the green agenda. You see councils up and down the country doing some fantastic things, not just declaring a climate emergency, but then doing something about it, whether it's on transport, whether it's on buildings, whether it's on planning, whether it's on waste. Liberal Democrat councils have been leading councils on the green agenda, and I want as leader to promote them, to celebrate them, and to encourage them and help them go even further forward.
And do you think, Layla, that you'll always be sort of beholden to maybe the Green Party for sort of, that you've been very honest about the help they gave you, if their policies, do you feel like you're always going to have to absorb some of their policies into what you're doing?
Never once have I needed to absorb anything from them. It's actually much more of a collaboration between us. And sometimes I do get asked, what is the real difference between what you and Labour and the Greens are saying on this agenda? And we're splitting hairs. Actually, what we end up doing is a race to the top. And I absolutely welcome that. So no, I in no way feel beholden. It's a conversation. And as we are now, 6%, 11 MPs, we obviously want to improve. That's a key part of why I want to be leader, is to make sure that we win at the next election, the next Westminster elections. But we have our own amazing policies that we can put forward. And if the platform overlaps with others, well, this is an endeavour that, frankly, we need to start now. We've got 10 years before it's going to be too late. And we are reeling towards that. We cannot wait. It has to be now, and we have to work cross-party. And I don't care who I work with, Labour, Greens, or indeed Conservatives, and there are Conservatives who care about this. I will work with anyone to make this happen. Absolutely anyone, anyone. This is the biggest issue facing our planet. This isn't the time to start playing tribal politics. I will work with anyone.
to you with a green agenda.
If Nigel Farage, I have to say, we've had this before. I have to say,
we'd have solved it by
I'm
then.
not wearing a hat, but I might eat it if it happened. And you know what, Nigel? If you want to come and chat green stuff with me over a pint, any time.
Okay.
You than me with that.
Okay. Okay, so we're going to go to another member's question here from George Schrager. So he's saying that he is against violence, but he is pro-Extinction Rebellion. In the event that their activities come up for debate in Parliament, where would you stand if there was a proposal to curb their activities by law? Leila, we'll go with you first.
I would absolutely oppose that. Absolutely oppose it. And first of all, it's worth saying that the vast majority of people who took part in XR, many of them from Oxford, West Abingdon and beyond, came here. I remember there was this one lovely moment when they came, and I don't know if you got yours, Ed, the trees. Do you remember the trees?
Yeah,
they gave all MPs a tree. And so for the day, all these MPs, it was right in the middle of Brexit, it was really tense. And we were all carrying around these saplings, wandering around. It brought a smile to people's faces. And the way that they campaigned was so innovative, so extraordinary, that it made a huge difference. Now, there are some parts of that movement that I don't agree with. I really just, for your own safety, please don't tie yourself to a tube. I mean, that's just silly. But I believe fundamentally as a liberal in freedom of protest, in freedom of expression, so long as it's done safely and it's done within the law. If there was any attempt to curb that, I would absolutely try and stop that. That's the wrong thing to do.
What about lying down on the bridges just out here to try and stop people walking across traffic? What about those kind of demonstrations?
When I heard people doing that, I could understand. And actually, I remember hearing in Facebook groups in Oxford, there were people in my own constituency who were involved. They recognised that what they were doing was disruptive, but it was safe. They weren't hurting anybody. And what they were doing was to make a point. And it's hugely inconvenient, but it's hugely inconvenient for everybody in the planet if we don't start to tackle the climate emergency. I think actually what we need to take from this is a bit like the Friday Strikes for Future. We need to do is to show them that we get this, and we need to show them that we understand the urgency. So long as it's not something that then brings entire cities to a halt for days on end and starts to affect economies and whatever, actually the way they did it I think was quite respectful.
And just quickly, do you think it's appropriate for them to do the demonstrations that we've seen in London, for example, during a coronavirus pandemic?
Well, I think we have to obviously always remember that the reason why we are observing physical distancing is to keep each other safe and keep the rest of the country safe. When there were protests, similar protests in Oxford and elsewhere, I did observe that while there were pictures that showed they were quite close, actually on the ground they weren't. But absolutely, any single person who's watching who wants to go on those protests, please do it safely. Not for your sake, for other people's sake.
Okay. So just quickly, before I go to Ed, I'd really like you to send in some questions. If you're at home, if you're watching, you can do it via YouTube. You can send in your question, and I think someone might be able to slip it in front of me, and I'll be able to put that to the two candidates. But we'll go back now to continue with questions about Extinction Rebellion. So, Ed, where do you stand from a law and order point of view towards this group?
It sounds like I'm quite close to George, who asked the question. I believe in non-violent, peaceful protest throughout the decades, centuries even. Non-violent, peaceful protest has got rights for women. It's been a key part of the civil rights movement. I put the fight for climate change as a fight for our rights alongside those. It's one of the modern fights that we have to engage in. And so non-violent political process is got a place. I do urge people who are protesting to keep safe. And some of the protesters, I'm afraid, did go too far, but I think they were a very small minority. I think it really got it up the agenda. And one thing I think we should do is listen to them. And I made an effort to go and talk to people from Extinction Rebellion to listen to their message. And the one thing that I really took away was they were saying politicians need to tell the truth about the climate. They were their words, tell the truth about the climate. And what they meant by that was how serious a situation it is. And it really is. The climate emergency is an emergency. You know, many of the scientists who, you know, have studied this in huge detail reckon we've got 10 years. And if we don't act in that 10 years, not just in the UK, but across the world, it'll be too late. And I think that's the message of Extinction Rebellion. And I think that's a challenge to us. And so I want our party to be the party who is clear that this has to be tackled. It's not something that's like, you know, something that we can do alongside everything else. It's got to be central.
And do you think there is sometimes it's justified to break the law to bring about your campaign?
Well, I'm not going to advocate that. I'm a lawmaker. And so I think for all lawmakers, one should be very careful before you advocate civil disobedience. But when you have non-violent, peaceful protests, rather than lawmakers criticising them, saying they're the mob and awful, you should listen to them. Listen to the protests. They, when you talk to them, they accepted that the consequences of their civil disobedience. They accepted that the police were in their right to arrest them, and they knew that. And so I think in a democracy, one has to give people that chance to make that protest, even if I'm not going to break the law myself, because I shouldn't. I'm a lawmaker.
So Ed's not going to break the law. Are you going to break the law?
I think most likely not. I've never done before, and I don't really like to think I would have to, but you know, imagine in 10 years' time we get to the point where we haven't made progress, and you know, would it take lying in front of a bulldozer to stop something? Might have it in me. I can't see it right now, and actually I would much rather that we as lawmakers change the law, changed hearts and minds, particularly on the Tory backbenchers, particularly those, I mean, Boris Johnson's greenifying the economy package that he put out after coronavirus was just pathetic. It was pathetic. And I think our job, the best thing we can do, is to stay out of prison and be there on the backbenches to tell him that his plan is pathetic. So that's my plan so far.
Kate, let's remember, it was Boris Johnson who said he'd lie in front of the bulldozers.
Well, quite.
To try to stop the third runway at Heathrow. No one ever believed him, by the way, but he did say it.
Okay, so I think we're going to go now to some of your sort of policy platforms, if that's okay. So, Ed, your green agenda and things that you've spoken about previously. So you support moving to 80% renewable energy. At least by 2030. Will that involve the Hinkley Point C power plant? Many now see that project as possibly being unacceptably close to China and not something that Britain should pursue in its interests. If that's not the kind of thing that we're going with, where else might this electricity come from?
Well, I mean, Hinkley Point C will either get built or it won't. And what I did on that was to make sure that nuclear faces its true costs, because it never used to in the past. That was why my worry about nuclear has always been the high cost and a lot of the hidden costs. So we made sure that it pays the cost of decommissioning, that it pays the cost of waste management. And what I actually did, although the contract was signed 2 years after I left office, what I did was make sure that the risks were transferred to the French. So if Hinkley Point C doesn't get built, and some people think it won't, we won't pay, it'll be the French.
Do you think it'll be built?
I genuinely don't know. If you look at the EPR design, it's not still properly built in Finland or Flamanville. And one of the reasons I insisted that the French carried the risk, because I didn't trust it would be built. And I also said that we needed to have to make sure that we could get the electricity from many other sources, and we wouldn't rely on that. And the sources I was really keen on was offshore wind. That's why I put so much emphasis. And now we are the world leader in offshore wind, and now everyone realises that the vast majority of our low carbon, zero carbon power will come from offshore wind. But it can't just come from wind offshore, it's got to come from onshore wind, it's got to come from solar. I would like it to come from tidal lagoon power. I still think there's tidal stream power is possible. I think wave power is possible. I think smart energy is possible. I also am very keen on something I pushed, which is cables linking the UK to other countries that have got sources of green power. So one cable that I helped get built, and it's opening I think next year, is a link between the UK and Norway. Norway has surplus hydropower. It's very cheap, very green. and it can operate like a green battery. And that cable that I helped get built will enable us to be able to use Norwegian hydropower.
Is it just that big?
No. I don't quite know how big it is, but it will be, when it's built, it will be the world's longest subsea cable, and it will connect us to Norwegian hydropower. And I almost think it's like magic, really. But the point of giving an example is to show there's a whole series of ways that we can get renewable power into our country, and they'll be a lot cheaper than nuclear and a lot safer than nuclear.
You're still keen for Hinkley Point C to be built?
Well, the contract's been signed by Mrs May, so there's a contractual obligation. My concern was because of the cost overruns and the expense of nuclear, that I wanted to make sure that the French bore the risk.
Yeah.
So if it doesn't get built, we don't pay.
But if it comes up in Parliament, debate, a vote, anything like that, would you lobby for it?
It's too late. The contract was signed by Mrs May. It's a contract before the law. It's a private law contract. And if we tried to come out of it, then they would sue us for the value of the contract. So I'm afraid it's too late on that one. The real issue is, do you want any of the new nuclear power stations built? And my answer is no.
Okay.
And the reason is no is because, thanks to Liberal Democrat policies, the cost of renewables has come down dramatically. When Hinkley Point C was thought of, offshore wind was £160. So £92 didn't look too bad. Now offshore wind is less than £40.
Yeah.
Dramatic change in about 6 years. So that has changed the whole economics and why nuclear just hasn't got a future.
So what do you think?
Well, I sat on a select committee that looked at Hinkley Point C and the value for money case, and the report that we did after the inquiry was pretty damning in terms of the value for money for the taxpayer, because whilst it's true that the government itself doesn't pay, it is the taxpayer that pays. It is going to be, if it's built, the consumer that pays, because essentially the price of the electricity was set. And at the moment, and actually credit, because renewables has dropped in price so much, that actually could end up costing people more. So that's my concern with it. My hope is that by supercharging our ability to have more renewable technology in this country, really pushing for things like onshore and offshore wind and tidal lagoons and elsewhere, that actually the price for renewables drops so low that it's not worth their time doing it, because actually people will choose not. But we'll see. And also it's outdated technology is the other issue that we have with Hinkley Point C. So let's see if it actually gets built. But if it came to the House, I think at this point it won't. But if it did, I would not think that right now building it would have been the right decision. But that's now, not then. Okay,
so but Layla, on your own policy, the Build Back Better concept, within that book, within that set of ideas, you've been talking about there should be very strict sustainability clauses in a free trade agreement and in any bilateral investment agreements. This is post-Brexit, right?
Yeah.
So, do you think that should be a priority, that some people might think that sustainability is going before trade, and particularly with the potential economic downturn that we're likely to see, is it a priority?
It has to be a priority, Kate. And actually, interestingly, this is really popular, keeping our environmental standards. We're talking a lot in this leadership contest about how do we win back Brexit voting people out there who thought that we weren't on their side. And if you look at what they care about, animal rights, environmental standards, all of that is incredibly important. And I do think that actually sustainability and trade should go hand in hand. In fact, when businesses got together last year, big business around the world, they themselves put forward ideas for how they could become more sustainable.
Aren't you worried that it would jeopardise an economic or trade deal?
I think actually the bigger risk is to not do it. Because if you look at the planet itself, if we don't take care of it, if we don't treat the planet as the finite resource that it is, all these businesses that are planning their long-term futures on markets that are just going to work as they currently do are going to find that the volatility that climate change brings, whether it be it affects countries where their clothes are made and those countries flood more and they flood worse, or there's another country where they are, you know, intending to get their meat or whatever from the Amazon rainforest, and you've got supply chains that are not sustainable. Those trees are being cut down, and as a result you have fires, and that supply chain fails. Actually, the smart thing for business to do is to be sustainable, and that's why I talk about sustainability being at the heart of absolutely everything, right up there with human rights clauses. I believe that sustainability clauses should be in trade deals as well.
And do you think the government should walk away from any deal that can't guarantee a sustainability element?
If this government was serious about its own commitment to saving the planet and its own commitment to zero carbon, not just here but also helping others abroad, then yes, it would. But it's also, we have to recognise that we can't do this alone as a country. It's one of the levers that we pull, is we say we want a trade deal that includes this. But we also have to realise that if we're going to be doing trade deals with countries that need help to do it, we've got an obligation to do that too. And so that's why my suggestion to raise the aid budget to 1%, using that 0.3% to help other countries achieve better sustainability, is the right thing to do, because this is a global infrastructure we're talking about here. We are not an isolationist party, we're an internationalist party. We want to trade with as many different people around the world as possible, but let's do it sustainably. It's the right thing to do.
Ed, are there any flaws in Layla's arguments there?
No, I totally agree with her. You know, this is, whether it's popular or not is one issue. The issue is it's essential. We haven't got a choice. We've got 10 years to sort this out. And actually, trade deals are an opportunity for pushing the green climate agenda. That's how I see them. You know, I want us to try to have, you know, zero emission vehicles, zero emission planes and trains. I want us to make sure that the energy intensive industries, the big heavy industries like cement and steel and paper and pulp, those ones that take so much energy and are responsible for so much carbon emissions, that as a world, and certainly leading as the UK, we make sure that their use of energy and their carbon emissions falls dramatically. I did quite a lot of work on this, and it's quite tricky actually. You need to invest in technologies like carbon capture and storage and so on and so forth. You need to have a real partnership with these different industries. But you can't just pretend you can do it by yourselves. We're just 2% of greenhouse gas emissions. We need to use every international lever at our disposal, whether it's our, you know, ideally in the EU, but the UN, at the WTO, in trade deals. The world has got to take this seriously. And if we were to sign trade deals that were, you know, carbon intensive and supported for the fossil fuel industry into the future, that would be betrayal of our generation, of our future generations.
Okay. Was there just anything you wanted to come back? No. Okay. Well, we're halfway through, a little bit over halfway through, and we're going to rattle through some different topics. So it might be a little bit faster than the format we've had so far. So, HS2. It has consistently been in Liberal Democrat manifestos. Ed, do you still want it to be built and completed?
Yeah, and there are two reasons. First of all, there's a real concern about capacity on our railways. Now that may seem odd at the moment because people aren't using the railways because of COVID, but there will be a time when there's a vaccine and people will go back to using public transport in the ways that we do now. And if we go back to anything like what was happening before, there's not enough capacity. And I don't want to see people in cars, I don't want to see people on planes, I want to see them on trains. So if you believe in public transport, you need to increase the capacity. And there's another element, because it is about trying to get rid of fossil fuel flight. You know, I'm hoping we can have zero carbon flight, but we've got a plan in case that isn't there, and therefore high-speed trains that give that extra capacity, I think, are part of that answer. HS2 could be done more environmentally friendly. There are different proposals for different routes, one particularly that takes it up the M1, which adds about 3 minutes and reduces the ecological impact dramatically. So one could look at those issues that affect nature and precious ancient woodlands and so on, because I think they are really important. But in terms of the overall climate change agenda and the need to shift onto public transport, that's the case for HS2.
And Layla, it's hugely expensive, but are you still backing HS2?
Just. Yes, and the reason I say just is because I actually obsess about value for money. I think it's really important that if we're going to spend taxpayers' money on this kind of thing, we have to show that it's good value for money, it's the right thing to do. But if we are going to invest not in roads, not in planes, but find ways of travelling up and down the country faster, we are going to need to invest in our rail network. And the thing that HS2 does is it's not just about HS2 itself, it's the extra capacity that it gives the whole of the network. So on the principle of it, I agree with it. I do think that we need to continue to hold HS2 Limited to account.
Yeah.
There's been some particularly bad examples of mismanagement in HS2 Limited, but I don't think that you should immediately throw the baby out with the bathwater. To the wider point about investment in rail, I mean, that is absolutely a huge part of what we need to now do as a country. In my own area of Oxford, West and Abingdon, I've been fighting against a highway called the Oxford to Cambridge Expressway and making the case to instead complete East-West Rail and make sure that it's fully electrified. And that needs to happen. That East-West connection across the country is very often the thing that's wrong. Tim Farron often says, you know, HS2 is a great idea, but it's the Southerner delivering it. So it starts in London and goes upwards. The best thing that you should have done was started it in the north, brought it down, and then connected it east-west.
Sure. Okay. So you're both in support still, just
about.
HS2?
Just
okay.
about.
Okay, I want to turn to fracking. Ed, do you regret your past support for fracking?
Well, what I managed to do in government was, first of all, slow the Tories' passion for fracking down, and then by passing regulations, I've actually stopped fracking in this country. When you're in government with the Tories, you have to play them. And my objective was to get the renewables, and boy, did we get the renewables. They wanted fracking. And so because
You wanted fracking too?
Well, the government wanted fracking, and therefore as a government minister, I had to make the case for it. But what did I do? Chris Huhne actually started the work on this. We looked at the problem with seismicity, the problem of earthquakes, because a lot of the fracking causes earth tremors. And so Chris has set up this review. It then reported when I became the Secretary of State, and I consulted on this review and the review's conclusions, and I put in place a regulation. It's called a traffic light regulation. And effectively, if there was an earth tremor, a minor earthquake, which registered 0.5 on the Richter scale, then they had to stop fracking. And I got agreement for that. And that regulation that I passed has been the most difficult obstacle for the fracking industry. So I'm pretty proud that the rule that I passed has stopped them, even when I was in a Conservative government, you know, fighting the Tories. And now I think the party's policy of banning fracking is absolutely the right one. It's really, really clear now that when we're trying to renew our heating systems and make our heating systems green, so we're not using gas from the North Sea or other types of gas, be it frack gas from America or wherever, we need to move to other systems, and we can do that faster than we thought just a few years ago.
So, Leila, I mean, fracking is probably not going to come back. It's certainly not under this Conservative government. But do you feel that it is a bit of a dark mark hanging over maybe the Liberal Democrats' environmental record?
My own view is, at the time, let's look at the science of what was going on, and what we were seeing from places like America, where they were fracking, was that there were these issues. And I actually think probably we shouldn't have done it, but it was a small part of a bigger agenda. I appreciate that, and you know, I accept what Ed was saying, that he was getting support from the Tories to do this because the Tories love it. There is absolutely no place for it now because it's a fossil fuel. You know, let's remember what we're doing with fracking. You are essentially driving up fossil fuels from beds under the ground, causing earthquakes, causing potentially problems with watercourses and other things. There should be absolutely no encouragement of it at all. And there are still Tories who talk about it, and you know, they need to actually just look at the big issues that are facing the country. There are better ways of doing this.
I think there's total agreement here. I mean, I think the reality is that we got that regulation through, and that actually stiffened the sinews of Tory opposition. And now even the Tories don't want fracking. And I tell you what, they used to be at me the whole time. They wanted me to push it through, and I refused. Okay.
Totally different question, style. But I like this one. This is from a few different members. Should veganism be party policy? Layla, are you a vegan?
I'm not a vegan. I'm Arab, and the reason I say that
You might need to explain that a bit more.
So, you've seen my big fat Greek wedding. That is my family. You don't eat no meat. It's okay. I make lamb. You know, that is very much part of our culture. And actually, on a very personal note, I really struggle. I've spoken about the fact that I had a bariatric operation years ago, and actually one of the things I struggle with is the fact that I struggle to get protein. So I do need protein in my diet that is very high concentrated protein, which actually, frankly, I can't really get without meat. However, the general point about encouraging people to veganism, and there are days that I am vegan. In fact, when I was a teacher, we ran an environmental group with the kids, and they suggested that as a school, we had meat-free Mondays, and that every Monday, the whole of the school, everybody stopped eating meat.
Okay.
And that was transformative. So I don't think we should be forcing anyone to do anything, because that's not liberal, but I do think we should be encouraging people to eat less meat, for sure.
Okay. Ed, are you a vegan, and should veganism be party policy?
I'm not a vegan, and no, it shouldn't, for the reason that Layla has so eloquently outlined. We're liberals, and I think telling people what they should eat in that particular way, which would be very prescriptive, is a step too far. However, first of all, my wife is a vegan. She's a fish-eating vegan.
Right.
So I'm not sure if that anyone else
heard
is.
of that. Okay.
So I therefore eat more fish than I used to, and more vegan meals than I used to. But I'm not going to pretend I don't eat meat as well. But I eat meat a lot less meat. And when you look at this very serious, because it's a very serious important that, you know, we've got to change our diets in order to tackle climate change. So the questioners have a good point here. And the question is, what's the best way of doing it? And if you look at the carbon emissions for different types of meat, you know, beef has huge amounts of emissions per kilogram of meat, much less when you get down to chickens.
So you're in favour of a reduction of meat consumption then?
Yeah, but I mean, I think you do it through education, you do it through awareness, you do it through, you know, dietary education. I think if you start passing, you know, draconian laws about what people should eat, what you'll do is you'll lose the argument. Okay. And I think we need to take people with us.
Yeah. Speaking of my Arabic mother, one of the things she said to me was actually she does want to do better things for the planet. She wants to know how to make better choices, but she doesn't feel she's got the information. And one of the things that I think would really help would be to have a traffic light system on our food, where, you know, as we've got food labelling that has what's in it, actually one of the things that we should be able to tell about our own food is what is the carbon footprint of that food. And I think that would go some way to firstly helping people to understand that there's a difference between different types of foodstuffs, how they're made. Obviously something that is made with a very sustainable supply chain will have a much lower carbon footprint. And actually I know that there are some businesses doing this now. And interestingly, they're doing it because they realise it's popular, and they recognise that there is an appetite out there in the public for companies to be more sustainable. But I think actually it's something we should look at legislating for.
Legislating for?
For a traffic light system on foods in supermarkets, yeah.
So this is very popular, veganism, I can hear it in my ear. We're having a question actually that perhaps is this not maybe the discussion around veganism a little bit of a privileged thing to be talking about, you know, when we're in an era of food banks and food poverty. Ed, what do you think about that?
Well, the person who made that point, sort of backing what I've said, is that people do need some choice. And, you know, many of us, I'm sure Layla has too, have been involved in food banks in our constituency. My wife's a local councillor in a ward called Norbiton in Kingston. It's got the largest social housing estate and has got, you know, quite a bit of deprivation. And so she and I have worked on that estate, me as the MP, Emily as the councillor. And because of its situation, we've been working with a particular group of people there who've been running the food bank on that estate. There's 2 or 3 food banks in my constituency, but this was a new one for COVID, set up in a local hall. And, you know, we were buying fresh fruit and vegetables to take to them, so it wasn't just the pasta and the tins and all the rest of it, which is so common in food banks. We want to make sure there's fresh fruit and veg. So food banks have played a critical role.
But is there space for discussion on veganism, promoting it, whilst we also have food banks?
Well, I'm agreeing that one's got to recognise where people are at, and when people are hungry, making sure they're fed with good food is something that we should be focusing in on, and should be a priority. And any politician worth their salt is worried when there are people in their community who are going hungry, and you've got to get out of your room, you've got to get out of your office, you've got to go and help them, whether it's talking to the council, whether it's talking to the government, whether it's actually taking direct action. It's a scandal. It's one of the reasons I think why Leila and I are both in agreement about reforming welfare. We both favour a universal basic income as one way of tackling things like food poverty.
Okay, right. Next subject, this is from another member. So, nature conservation is failing in the UK. What policies would you propose to prevent biodiversity collapse? And we'll just go with one policy idea, if that's okay, rather than a huge list.
Right, okay. Well, I think actually the most important thing that we can do is plant trees. And
60 million trees.
60 million, was it 60? Yeah, it's 60. It's our
manifesto
promise.
It was a lot of trees.
It's a lot of trees, but it needs to be a lot of trees. And the reason why it needs to be a lot of trees, and by the way, not just one type of tree, because the other thing that we need to avoid is monocultures. And I would like to see that very much as part of a broader plan to rewild Britain that includes meadows, that includes all sorts of different fauna and flora, so that we can ensure that we tackle the biodiversity crisis too. We've got to remember, we are in the middle of a mass extinction right now. The 6th planetary mass extinction is happening before our very eyes. And if we don't get a grip on this, then that is going to be just as big a crisis, the nature emergency, as the climate emergency.
Ed, I'm sure you also want to plant trees because you are a Liberal Democrat, but any other policy ideas in terms of biodiversity?
Nature and biodiversity needs the strength that the Climate Change Act has given the whole of government, the whole of the country, tackle climate change, needs the equivalent for nature and biodiversity. So we need a strong piece of legislation which is independently monitored, that holds government to account, with a whole programme going over years, but with early action to make sure we are looking over our whole nature. So that's a piece of legislation. I think it's really important to have that tough legal underpinning. But if I can choose one particular bit in nature, given Leila's nicked trees from me, I want to have bees.
Oh, okay.
And the reason I want to have bees
Trees and bees.
It's partly because of my mother-in-law. She's a beekeeper. She's the swarm officer for North Dorset. So if there's a swarm of wild bees, she goes out and collects them, and she teaches bees. So if I didn't say bees, I'd be told off.
Okay, lovely. Okay, so this question is from the Green Lib Dems. They have pointed out that during the coronavirus, manufacturing companies were sort of pivoted by government to make respirators, to make PPE equipment. Would either of you support a national campaign, this is the suggestion from the Green Lib Dems, to pivot arms manufacturing companies towards making renewable energy equipment? Leila, you're nodding your head.
I like it. Yeah, I mean, as a general point, I'm very uncomfortable with our defence industry, the arms industry. We should be looking at how do we stop some of the people that we're selling arms to, Saudi Arabia in particular. But we also need to recognise, and actually there's a general point to be made here, there are things that we want to try and stop doing as a country. You know, the arms trade is one, but also the fossil fuel industry. There are huge numbers of jobs in Aberdeenshire, for example, that rely on North Sea oil. If we're going to move away, we cannot do what Margaret Thatcher did to communities in the 80s and make huge changes to sectors of the economy without just transition funds to encourage them to do something else. And I love the idea that, you know, these amazing companies who've got incredible people working for them are repurposed into something that is better for the planet and better for the country. It's going to take time, but this is one of the areas that I do think we should be pushing Boris Johnson on much more, because it is going to take subsidy, it's going to take a mass retraining programme, but there was never a better time. Oil prices are tanking right now. This is the time for us to actually start to make that massive shift.
Can you imagine what they might be able to make?
Oh, goodness, wind turbines, love a wind turbine. I mean, there's so many different things that they can make. And actually, more to that, I want them to imagine new things to make, because innovation is a huge part of what we now need to do. Again, the studies that show what do you do to recover the economy after coronavirus, fifth on that list is research and innovation. And so actually money spent on innovation so that they can, create that new ecosystem of carbon capture and storage. There is so much that we should be spending that money on.
Do you like the idea?
Well, I'm a member of the Green Liberal Democrats. I haven't heard this policy before,
Oh, right,
but it's a nice new one.
But
clearly, we want to make sure that the arms industry is controlled and used for much better purposes. I wouldn't necessarily go to renewable power. I'd be thinking about airplanes, greening air, greening flight. I talked about before. I'd be talking about vehicles. Can we learn lessons? Because these engineers who are making military vehicles, could they turn their skills and ingenuity to green transport? That seems a sort of better fit.
Okay.
But on renewable power, I think the oil and gas industry is where I would go. I'll tell you this story.
Quickly, Ed, if that's okay. Little story.
I'll spare it you. All I'm saying is there's lots of skills and expertise in the oil and gas industry, which is probably directly more relevant for the renewable power industry in the North Sea.
Okay. Ed, if we could stay on you, we've got a few questions here. What could supermarkets do to try and cut their waste and emissions? And this is an issue raised by Doris.
Doris, well, interesting question, Doris. Well, first of all, they need a really clear audit of where their emissions are mostly coming from. Are they coming from their buildings and the way their doors open? Are they for the freezers, the chiller cabinets? Are they from their transport? They should do an audit of every aspect of the whole chain that brings the food into the supermarkets and we go in and buy it and take it home. And therefore, if you do that, you can really then target every next bit so you can reduce the emissions. And that, by the way, is how we're going to have to tackle everything going forward. Our whole lives need to, and every part of business, of the public sector, everything has got to play its part, has got to step up. And I think the supermarkets could do a lot more, but there are some who do take it serious. Let's also be fair. Marks and Spencer's had an amazing plan, Plan A. The idea was, there's no Planet B, and so Plan A was how do you sort it out. And so, all credit to them. Final thing I would say on supermarkets, which isn't often discussed, and I did some work with them in government, was to get them to have other sources for the goods they want to sell, whether it's palm oil or whatever, than from rainforests. They've got to make sure that what they are putting on the shelves are sustainable and not damaging the climate and our environment more broadly.
Okay, Layla, what do you think supermarkets could be doing more to cut their waste and emissions?
Well, I think the first thing that comes to mind is, of course, packaging. You do your weekly shop and, the 5p tax on plastic bags was great, but it was a very small start into a much, much bigger problem, which was the amount of cellophane that we've got on our fruit and vegetables, the fact that you have your weekly shop and then you end up with a pile of plastic packaging. And I'm really proud of, there are lots of shops in Oxford now that have moved to zero waste packaging. And you go in and they encourage you to have your little tub and you fill up your Rice Krispies and then you get another tub and you fill up your pasta. And it does take a little bit of extra planning, but actually it's been incredibly popular. And I think there is a movement now to do that. But the other thing I think they should be doing is an end to buy one, get one free.
Mm-hmm.
The idea, it's about mentality of waste. Plan what you're going to eat. And if you're in a supermarket, buy what you need to eat without planning potentially to hoard something. This sort of hoarding mentality, the mentality that makes people buy two of something when they didn't even need it.
With the government's suggestion to get rid of these bog-off deals?
I think that's the right thing to do. I think there's a number of different reasons to do it too. They launched their obesity strategy just this week. I've been actually fairly critical of the way they've done it because I think there's a lot of fat-shaming language in the way that they've done it. But nevertheless, there are things in it that I agree with, and getting rid of bog-off is certainly one of them.
Okay. This question is one that I wanted to put in. So the Liberal Democrats, due to the loss of a number of seats, particularly in rural areas, particularly in the southwest, you'll know that maybe that connection with farming communities has maybe been lost a bit because it used to be such a big part of sort of Liberal Democrat identity. look, specifically, if you had a message to farmers, Ed, what would it be? Why should they, vote Lib Dem?
Because the Tories are so awful. Brexit is going to damage so many farmers. These trade deals the Tories are so keen on, particularly the one with Donald Trump that's being talked about, would damage farmers, would undermine consumer standards, would undermine food safety standards, would undermine animal welfare standards. And I think a lot of farmers who might well have voted Tory in the past, who probably didn't ever consider voting Liberal Democrat, might well be waking up. And when I've talked to my colleague Tim Farron, who of course does represent a rural constituency, when I've talked to Liberal Democrat councillors across the country who represent rural areas, and we do represent a lot of rural areas at council level still, they say that their constituents who are in agriculture are really, really worried. And so there's actually an opportunity there, because we are a party that believes in Britain being close to Europe, ideally being at the heart of Europe, because we're a party that, yes, believes in free trade, but wants to maintain those standards, be they for animals, be they for consumers, I think that will resonate with so many people. So there's actually an opportunity for us in rural areas to come back.
But how can you actually advocate for farmers effectively in Parliament?
Well, first of all, Tim Farron does. He represents many farmers. I was up in his constituency meeting one particular farmer who was a hill farmer, and lots of flocks of sheep on the hills in the lakes. So, if you want to talk about farming, Tim Farron knows an awful lot about it and advocates it. I only have 5 farms in my constituency, and I don't think they're huge. But, I do occasionally talk to the farmers there. But seriously, I think with Tim, with many of our councillors, we can advocate and we can champion. And some of the things that the Conservatives are proposing, not just the trade deals, just are going down very badly. And we need to be the voice of not just farmers, but the rural areas and rural communities. Whether it's on post office, on transport, whether it's on broadband, whether it's on the economy. We can be the champions of rural areas. We must be. We must be the campaigners across the country.
And Layla, what would your message be to farmers or people that work in agriculture?
Yeah, well, even if you are a farmer who didn't vote Liberal Democrat, we are on your side and we will fight for you. And I think that's what we have to tell them as a message. We are making sure that it's in the interest of the whole of our country that our amazing stewards of the land, because in essence, that's what they are. These are our key partners. We spoke about biodiversity earlier. These are going to be our key partners in helping to deliver that. You asked me for, one policy, which was trees, but the other one is hedges. Joining up hedges across our rural areas to encourage more wildlife to be able to spread from one area to the other. It's going to be about paying them to make sure that they can be the stewards of the land that they are. And how do you campaign for it? Well, actually, this is an area where partnering with the media is so important. And the campaign that I've been running with, of all people, the Daily Mail, has been on this issue. Chlorinated chicken coming into our country, undercutting the prices of already cash-strapped farmers who are price takers and not price makers as it is. And I challenge Liz Truss to have a meal of chlorinated chicken. I mean, it's a silly thing, but the point is, if we're going to influence the Conservatives, you have to change public opinion.
Have you been to America?
Yes, I have.
Have you eaten chicken in America?
I did.
You've probably eaten chlorinated
I know
chicken.
I have, and actually there's a reason why I love living in Europe, because I know the kind of food standards that they have here, incredibly processed foods. They're very, very bad for you. And we have to appreciate the standards that we have in this country. We help to develop. They are British EU standards. We should not be giving those up lightly.
Okay, so going to the Lib Dem manifesto. So I just wanted to know what your thoughts are. I know we've talked a lot about net zero emissions, but 2045 was in the manifesto, so that's 5 years below what the Conservatives were promising. I mean, do you actually think that it's achievable? And I know that you will say, anything's possible, but, considering the huge global change we've had with the pandemic, do you still think 2045 is a realistic target?
It was always an ambitious target, but it was very honest. And I think it's worth saying to people, I mean, that one of the reasons why the framing of it seemed quite Goldilocks was because there were other parties that were fiddling around the edges, not including things in it. In particular, we were addressing the really big issues, the issues around transport, the issues around agriculture. We were including everything and making sure that that 2045 target was achievable at the time. But actually, coronavirus is an excuse to supercharge it. And that's why, carbon negative, we should be aiming for as a framing of that policy. Frankly, if you achieve carbon neutral by 2045, the next day you end up carbon negative by planting another tree. So it's an entirely achievable aim in of itself. But the framing of it ended up being lost at the last election. And that's what we now need to do as Lib Dems, is take our brilliant policies. Policies is made by the membership. If you guys make the prose, then the job of the leader is to somehow turn it into something exciting. They do the poetry, that's what they do. It's the hearts and not just the minds. So let's take our incredible policies and then sell it in a way that really makes people understand that we get it.
And Ed, honestly, do you still think, considering what's happened with coronavirus, the potential economic damage on the horizon, do you still think zero emissions by 2045 is possible?
See, I don't agree with the premise of the way you're putting the question, Kate. You're sort of suggesting that going green should be costly. Actually, going green should be cheaper and make us more competitive. So I want to go green faster because of COVID, because I think it's good for jobs and good for the economy. And 2045, I think, was a very well thought through policy. The people who delivered that should get credit because it was really well done and show that we could go faster than the government. Not just sort of dream, but actually had concrete, policies behind it. If I had a criticism of it, I think they could have factored in a bit more on the innovation and technological change, which mean we could potentially go even faster. Let me give you an example of why I'm saying that. Solar prices and the price of solar, and the price of batteries, the price of wind, if you looked at them just 5 years ago, you'd have never thought they'd have got to where they are now. And we're seeing innovation happening globally with these types of industries, and it is driving the price down. And when you have good policies, and Liberal Democrats have put in some good policies, and you work with other countries, you can see technical innovation really delivering. And when you see those prices going down quickly, what does that mean? It means you can deploy faster. It means your industry can be more competitive. It means you can do more trade. So I don't believe that going green is a cost. I think it is essential, and I think it's an opportunity.
Okay, thank you very much, guys. We've covered loads of different questions there. So we're going to go to the closing speeches, 2 minutes each, and you should maybe think about what members should take away from you and your green agenda. So Layla, let's go first with you with your 2 minutes.
Well, thank you so much, Kate. Thank you to you all at home. I've really enjoyed myself today. Such incredible ideas coming in the questions in the first place. And what it tells us is that environmental policy must underpin everything. It can't just be an add-on to business as usual. Every decision that government takes, every policy that the party makes has to have a positive impact on the environment. And this government needs to be held account and forced to take its climate emergency seriously. But in order for us to be able to shoulder this responsibility and make the case for liberalism, we must change. We must build on our strengths as a party and push forward from the mistakes of the past. Steady as she goes won't cut it anymore. We cannot risk dropping lower than already single-figure polling. And with the right strategy and a leader that I know people can trust, we can do better. We can rebuild our strong council base and be that political force again that is to be reckoned with. My campaigning vision of education, the environment and the economy has been informed by voters, and it's already getting serious cut through. We need to build our relevance as a party so that we can promote our liberal vision. We need to rebuild trust again so that we can start winning again from the grassroots, winning council seat after council seat, winning whole councils, so that we can put our green agenda at the heart of communities. Because when you vote Lib Dem, you get Lib Dems. And when you get Lib Dems, you get stuff done. Electing me as our leader sends a clear signal to voters that we've learned and that we need to reinvigorate our party, to hold government to account. I am that leader. Vote for me and let's move forward together.
And Ed?
My commitment to the environment came before my commitment to the Liberal Democrats. I read a book by Jonathan Porritt called Seeing Green when I was 18, and it changed my life. It had lots of liberal ideas in there, but it told me that the environment was under threat, and it became a bit of a life mission for me. And the reason I joined the Liberal Democrats was because, yes, I was by then had read some political philosophers and was a classic liberal, but it was Paddy Ashdown and Simon Hughes talking about the green agenda, talking about it in a way that no other politicians were talking about. And I joined our party when we were just 4% in the opinion polls 30 years ago. And I've seen the ups and downs, but I'll tell you what I've seen. I've seen when leaders stand for clear messages, the party succeeds. And I think that's why I believe I have the vision, because the environment is written through me. But I like to think I have that experience working with leaders like Paddy Ashdown, who's so great on the environment, but also in government. You know, I negotiated with the Tories and won on climate, the quadrupling of renewable power. I negotiated across the EU. I set up a group called the Green Growth Group and made Europe have tougher targets. And then we went to the United Nations and we got the world to have tougher targets. So that negotiation experience is something I can bring to the party, as well as that passion for this issue. And I would want to work across the party. I want the whole party to campaign on the environment. Local government in particular. You know, my wife is redeveloping a housing estate in her ward, and she's making sure the new homes, the new council homes, are zero carbon, and she's going to be using a heat coming from a local sewage works. This is the innovation that we can do now in local government. And I want to lead a party that is known for the environment. You know what? Recent leaders haven't talked about the environment enough. If you elect me as leader, you'll soon be bored of the fact that I'll talk about the environment all the time, that green economy, because nothing is more important, turning our economy and our society and turning our world so we stop climate change and we build a world that is fairer, that is more peaceful, and that is safe.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Ed and thanks to Layla. There's some really wonderful questions there, and thank you to everybody who were sending in the questions from home. I could hear them all in my earpiece, so I'm very grateful for that. So after the environment, next week the Hustings will focus on education, skills and culture. So I hope you're able to come and join us then. I've been Kate Proctor, political correspondent for The Guardian, and thank you very much for having me.